Welcome back. We're going to be covering Chapter 9, which is Prejudice. So let's get started. So there are pathways for acquiring prejudices. One pathway for us to acquire a prejudice towards a group of people or certain types of people would be through socialization. We can be taught to hold certain attitudes about certain kinds of people. And we learn that through all the different socialization routes that we've talked about before when we talk about how we internalize our gender roles or all these other things that we get through society, of course. So, of course, our parents play a role, our teachers play a role, our peers play a role, the media plays a role. All the normal places where you would expect messages to be conveyed would be the route to socializing these attitudes. Another pathway for acquiring prejudice sounds a little bit surprising: egalitarianism. This idea that everybody is, born equal can be a source of prejudice, because if we assume that everybody was born with the same advantages or disadvantages or the same, experiences and upbringing, if we sort of look at all people as if they are in fact the same, then it's easier to sort of blame a person who's not doing as well, or who has addiction, or who has, certain characteristics. It's easier to say, well, they probably did something to bring it on themselves. So this idea that everybody starts out the same can be a source of sort of scapegoating or blaming the victim when when things are going wrong. Now you see up in the right-hand corner the word mobiles. That's my little memory jogger to remind myself to do a little activity in class where I provide bags of supplies to, usually I try and divide the class into like 4 groups. If it's too large, then I'll divide it up into maybe 6 groups. And I give them the supplies to make mobiles. And on the outside, it looks like everybody's getting the same things. Everybody gets some hangers, and everybody gets some string and some paper. And you're supposed to make, I tell the group, make a mobile that illustrates some concept from psychology, from social psychology. And so they all work for a while, and soon it becomes apparent that some people had scissors in their bag and other people didn't. And some people had glue in their bag and other people didn't. And, some people have stickers, and some people have, markers. Some people have just crayons or pencils, and you can only use what I provided to you. So you can't pull things out of your book bag. And so what you find out pretty quickly is that people are saying, hey, can I borrow those scissors, to another group? Things like that. And what's really interesting is as soon as people start to realize that some groups got better stuff than others, that egalitarianism attitude goes away, right? It's like, wait, that's not fair. I wasn't provided with the same things that other group was provided with. And it drives home a really stark, example of how it isn't the case that everybody is necessarily set up with the exact same skills, the exact same advantages, the same, socioeconomic status, or, family structure, or whatever factors could go into developing our characteristics. All the things that we talk about that can contribute to our characteristics. We weren't all set up with the same, blueprint, right? Our social settings sort of have affected us differently. And so we should be really acutely aware of assuming that everybody is approaching a problem from the same place we are. Let's say, for example, let's just imagine for a second that you're a college student. Imagine that. It's easy to kind of think that whatever your struggles are similar to the struggles that your classmates may have, whereas you may not have the same struggles. Like maybe you have a classmate who literally sleeps in their car and has to eat at the food bank just to go to class. Like they don't have any other option. And they know that to get where they want to go in life, this is what they have to do, and they don't have any other option. Not because they, had a falling out at home or something like that, but literally because they couldn't do it unless they were willing to have this extra struggle. We oftentimes don't think about that. It doesn't cross our minds that people might have something harder to deal with than what we're dealing with, or that, not everybody comes from a place that we're coming from. And so that egalitarianism idea can lead us to think, okay, we all started out the same, and you must have really messed up to be living in your car. Like, as I just gave that excuse, not because they had a falling out at home, right? Because the first thing we do is we say, well, I mean, what did you do that caused you to not be able to live at home? When it may have nothing to do with the person who's living in their car. It may have everything to do with, the people in the home, right? So those are the things that can contribute to us assuming that it's sort of the other person's fault that they're in the circumstance that they're in. And, if you've ever had any kind of physical malady, maybe a permanent one or a temporary one, where other people then kind of regarded you differently now because maybe you weren't strong as you were before the illness, and it took a little while to sort of build that back up. Or maybe you had a limp, or couldn't squeeze as hard, or things like that, that maybe anybody who meets you thinks this is how you are. You inside yourself know, well, this is temporary. This is a recent occurrence, and I'm going to get over it, right? Like, once I recover fully from mono, I'll be back, right? That kind of thing. And, a lot of times people will sort of assume this is how you are, and that maybe something you did caused you to be in the circumstance, because we all started out the same. We all are naturally healthy. All of us are naturally these ways. And so that's what we mean here about egalitarianism contributing to prejudice. Hopefully I gave enough examples that you really get what I'm talking about. Oh, well, apparently my animation is not working very well. So under egalitarianism, I was really talking really heavily about the equality of opportunity issue. I'd also like to introduce this term, the relative deprivation hypothesis. So when we talk about, living standards in particular, that's what's depicted on the y-axis in this graph on the right. Over time, if we're sort of moving along our living standards are sort of going along with our expectations, we're decently, we think the world's pretty fair. As long as things are kind of going along in the way that we sort of expected them to, we think, well, I work hard and that's how I get what I get. Or, somehow I'm doing stuff that I, is leading me to get what I deserve. When you have something that happens where our attainments drop off, our expectations are still going up, but our actual attainments are plateauing or dropping off. That's when we start to experience what is known as relative deprivation, where our achievements are not meeting our expectations. That's when we start to say things like, oh, I can see where the world isn't fair. Here I am working hard, and no matter what I do, I'm still not getting where I expected to be by this point in my life, or by this point at this job, or by this point in this quarter, or whatever it is. When I was at a conference, probably 15 years ago now, this really stuck with me. It was an excellent demonstration, and it's really super time consuming, so I've never been able to actually do it in my classroom. But the basic premise was that, we all were at a teaching conference where we were learning different techniques for teaching different kinds of concepts and stuff. And they were very vague about what this concept was going to be. It was advertised as like how to teach social psychology or how to teach about prejudice or something. It was pretty vague. So we didn't really know what we were getting into. I thought, honestly, we were going to be doing I thought it was going to be mostly a lecture. So when we walked in and we found 3 circles of chairs in the meeting room, we were all a little surprised by that. And then the people who were running it were like, oh, just take a seat wherever you want and, pick a circle and join the circle. And ultimately all 3 circles filled up. And we were all sitting with our circle of people talking and so on. I arrived a little bit later than my work colleagues did. And so they were all in a circle that was already full. And so I was the only person from my group, and there were probably 8 or 10 of us that were all at the conference. I was the only one from my group who was sitting in this other circle. And then there was another colleague who came even later. So my circle was full, and he actually got placed in a 3rd circle. And he was by himself as far as our colleagues. So it's a pretty elaborate game where you're supposed to have these tokens in your hand, and you're supposed to try and trade with other people to get a group of tokens that would be worth the most for you. And so you were supposed to go up and try and grab hands with somebody, and then you negotiate how you're going to trade tokens to your best advantage. And you couldn't let go of hands until you'd made a deal. And so in the first round, we were all just sort of walking up to whoever and grabbing hands and trying to make a deal, and all trying to figure out the rules and stuff. It was actually pretty complex. And so we all get back. They gave us some amount of time to trade. We all get back to our seats, and we had to report out loud to them what we had in our hand right now. And they wrote it on the board, and there was like all these, they'd write your name, and then they did some calculation to tell you, how many points you had. And then they told us to talk amongst ourselves for a few minutes while they then rank ordered all of us by points. And so there's your name with your points next to you, and you could really visually see how you placed relative to other people and stuff like that. I was in the middle, and I noticed that all of my colleagues who had gotten there earlier were all at the top, and my colleague who got there later was towards the bottom. And so my first instinct was that my colleagues who got there earlier must be better negotiators, right? Like, how did they get so many more points than I did? And then I thought, oh, my poor guy who was late, obviously he's not very good at negotiating. Like that's the thought I had. So they made us go through that a few more times. And ultimately, it became really clear that the people who were in that first circle were scoring points that were way higher than those of us who were in the middle circle. And we were scoring way higher than the people who were in that third circle. So it became really clear that we were not performing at the same level. So at some point, so the next round, I went right to my friend who had the lower score, and I grabbed hands with him, and he said to me, I don't think we all started off with the same tokens. And I kind of looked at him like, well, geez, why don't you make an excuse for your terrible trading skills? Like that was really weird. Why would you go right to some kind of nefarious interpretation? That's weird. And so I didn't believe him. I wasn't buying what he was saying. Well, it turned out he was right, that they had given the best tokens to the first circle, the mediocre tokens to those of us in the middle, and the worst tokens to the people in the third circle. So it turned out at the end of the game, he was completely right. But being in the middle, like I was, it was hard for me to believe that he was where he was just by chance, and that the people who were doing so well were just there by chance. Being in the middle made it easier for me to make an excuse, right? Well, I guess I just have to try harder. Oh, he needs, he obviously doesn't know what he's doing. It was a lot easier for me to say, I guess I'm doing okay. I'm doing better than some people. Yeah, I'm doing worse than those people, but I'm basically doing okay. And you can kind of imagine this is a combination of both the equality of opportunity issue, right? Like I assumed we all started off with the equal opportunity. He correctly, it turns out, recognized that no, we didn't. And then there's also this relative deprivation component that especially the people in the third circle really picked up on quickly, because they were like, I would expect to be getting better and better as I go and trade, but what's happening instead is I'm doing worse and worse. Like it was getting more and more distinct that, that bottom group was really not doing well, and that the top group really was doing well. So the advantages like multiplied for them, and the disadvantages really, multiplied for the disadvantaged group. And those of us in the middle sort of just stayed in the middle. And here's the kicker I have to throw in, though. This isn't really related exactly to equality of opportunity or relative deprivation, but here's the thing that is really interesting about Prejudice. So the group that had the top score, they were allowed to come up with a rule for the game. You can add on a rule. And so the group conferred and came to the conclusion that the rule would be you can only trade with people in your own circle. What a great way to preserve your status. I thought it was very telling that a bunch of, college and university, instructors and professors who are supposed to be, wanting to help people and things like that, the first rule they came up with is something to preserve their status. So no longer do we have to interact with these middle class and lower class people. Just the high class people will trade with each other. And that was really telling. And according to the people who are running the seminar, it happens pretty much every time. It doesn't matter whether they're doing this with corporate people or academic people, or it doesn't matter who they're working with, people in prison. It doesn't matter who they work with. This is how it always turns out, that the people who are advantaged want to keep their advantage. And so they immediately said, we're not trading with any other group. So that's not exactly tied to egalitarianism per se, but it's just one of these next steps of how we can preserve our position, even in the face of, like, why would I compete honestly when I could just go ahead and, cooperate with the people in my own group? So, when we talk about egalitarianism, something that we have to think about is whether we should be focusing on the equality of the outcome for everyone, because there honestly, equality of opportunity is what we really want to focus on, right? Equality of opportunity. It shouldn't matter whether a person comes from an educated background or a lower educated background. They shouldn't matter what their socioeconomic status is at all. Everybody should have the same opportunities in life, right? It doesn't matter anything about your biological makeup. None of that should matter. Like, everybody should have equality of opportunity. What unfortunately starts to happen is that we become so self-focused that we start to think the only way for equality is for not just we have the same opportunity and we can all equally work at, all of our efforts directed in the correct way would result in the same outcome. Instead, we say, no matter how much effort, or no matter whether my effort is being directed in the right way, I still expect the same outcome. And that's a different aspect of egalitarianism. This idea that all people, regardless of effort or skill or ability, should have the same outcome. Which what typically happens when we make that argument is that the people with the skill or the effort start to go, well, if we're all going to get the same outcome, I might as well socially loaf. Throwing back to the previous chapter. Like, why would I be carrying everybody on my back if we're all going to get the same outcome anyway? And so it's a tricky thing to say that we should all end up with the same outcome. It's not a tricky thing to say we should all start with the same opportunities, right? Because of self-interest, in the face of everybody getting the same outcome, oftentimes we'll end up with social loafing because people are self-interested. Why would I do more and get less? I might as well do less and get the same as everybody else is getting. So these are social psychological principles that really play out economically and in the social, on the social stage all the time, right? Like in actual discourse and things like that all the time, especially right now. Over the past year, we've had a lot of conversations about, basically equality of outcome. And because of people's self-interest, they believe that they should get the same outcome regardless of, effort or whatever, rather than they should have the same opportunity for the same outcome. So, all right, let's go ahead and stop here, and we will come back in the next segment and talk a little bit more about these pathways for acquiring prejudices.